All right, welcome to our rhetoric and writing lecture for this week. Week 7, February. I got my dates wrong again here. I'm having a lot of typos today, guys, so bear with me. But it's our February 28th to March 4th, so we're actually going to March this week. But what we're going to talk about, it is a very important topic, I think, and I always feel like as an English teacher, it's my responsibility to teach students about this. Again, it's something you're probably familiar with, you've learned at different times, but whether you've been away from school for a while or just maybe haven't, if you hadn't taken an English class maybe for a while, this is something that probably most people need a little bit of a refresher on. And again, it'll help with our class, although we're not really doing a full-blown research paper in our class, but it still helps to know how to cite your sources, how to paraphrase, summarize, and so on. But it really can help with other classes. If you're doing a research paper, for example, and maybe you're just having trouble with the citing of sources and stuff, our textbook has lots of information, so I'm just going to basically touch on that, give you the page numbers so you know where to go. And then, again, if it's something you're doing this semester or next semester, if you do keep your textbook, you could always look back at this, or these are things you can also Google. One of the places that I would look if you were trying to figure out how to cite your sources or how to do MLA format or whatever formatting that your instructor in another class might request is a place called the Purdue OWL. That's from Purdue University, and it's OWL, O-W-L, just like the bird, right? And it stands for Online Writing Lab, and they have just lots and lots of materials there. If you go in, you search for how to cite sources or how to write an MLA paper or APA paper, they'll give you lots of stuff, plus grammar tips and all kinds of things. So anyway, just a really good source, that Purdue OWL. If whether it's in this class or another class, you need a little help with either doing research or writing papers. So let's get started with this. This is in the Harbrace book from pages 69 to 80. If you have a different edition, it's section 9A to 9A, 9H. And again, like I said before, this class does not require that you do research. I'm not asking you to do a research paper in this class. However, you may bring in some outside sources. And if you choose to do that, you want to be able to cite those correctly. And also, you may be doing this in other classes. I've had lots of students who are taking psychology, humanities, different classes like that where they do a lot of writing history, and so this can sometimes be really valuable. So there's two kinds of sources that we're going to talk about. And again, we're not going to go into much detail. The book goes into a lot more detail on this, but one kind of source is what's called a primary source. That provides firsthand information. So if you were in a humanities class, this might include like looking at a letter that somebody actually wrote, maybe one historical figure writing to another, historical records, papers, artwork, photographs, video recordings, audio. We have a primary source down here. It might be hard to see this, but these are all documents or images kind of related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And so what you see here is an actual film that was taken. Now, you might think there were lots of films of, the president was driving by. Why wasn't everybody filming? Well, if you remember, this was in the 1960s, and there was one thing missing that everybody probably has on their person at any given moment. And so there would have been, if it was today, there would have been 1,000 people filming, right? Because everybody would have their phone out filming the president going by. But no, there was one film that they know about, a home movie made by a man named Abraham Zapruder, and that became like a very important primary source of information when they were trying to research the Warren Commission, trying to figure out how was President Kennedy assassinated. Was this a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, who did this, or was somebody helping him? So that is really an example of a primary source, because it was videoed at that moment or filmed, and then it was used for research for a long time. In the social sciences, it might be things like field observations, case histories, interviews, survey data, all this kind of stuff. If a teacher asks you to go out and survey a bunch of people, in a sense, you're doing primary research. You're getting information from others. Now, another kind of source, and this is the kind that we mostly deal with when we're doing writing in college, is secondary sources. These are commentaries on or descriptions of primary sources. So here's a book, The Killing of a President. It was a book that was written long after, years after, I believe, President Kennedy's assassination. And in this book, they included reports and all kinds of different things, but it was a commentary on it. It wasn't like something like the Zapruder film, which was, or it wasn't like a letter from John F. Kennedy to his wife or something. It may have included that, but it's somebody commenting. So secondary sources are usually in books, can be films and things too, but these are things that we normally use. So most of your instructors in college are going to probably not ask you to do research where you have to get primary sources. But if they ask you to go out and survey people, you're essentially doing that. most of the time they're going to say, go to the databases at the library, go find a book, go find an article, and use that. And those, again, are secondary sources. That's normally what, especially in undergrad, when you get to graduate school, sometimes that can change, but it can also change in different disciplines. But again, this is mostly what we're going to talk about, secondary sources. All right, so let me just keep going here and get my image out of the way. Kind of trying two cluttered slides here to fit myself in here. So, again, your instructor may also say, I really want up-to-date sources. And that usually means within the last few years. And up-to-date can mean different things depending on the discipline. If you're doing something really tech-heavy, maybe it's computer programming or something to do with medicine, or lots of things that are changing all the time, then these up-to-date sources might have to be within a few years. But you can always ask your instructor what they mean by that. They say up-to-date sources, like how recent, is it the last 5 years, last 10 years? And then sometimes it doesn't matter so much. Older sources, if you're researching Shakespeare, I mean, there are new things that people can say about that, but really a lot of things that have been said about him might not be that much different from the 1950s. You might be able to pull older sources like that. Again, it depends a lot on what you're doing. So you might always just ask your instructor, if you're doing a research paper, how recent the sources need to be, or if they have any opinion on that. This is maybe the most important part of finding sources, is the idea between biased and unbiased sources. It's very tricky sometimes to separate this out, but you want to try to find, if possible, it's best going to support your paper, your thesis, your ideas, if you can find unbiased sources. The idea that this is treating all points fairly. Again, that can be really challenging because so many sources are biased. You can include a biased source, but as a writer, you want to be able to recognize, I know these guys are really on the right or on the left or whatever political stance they take, but I'm including them, and you maybe give a reason for why. But as long as you're aware of it, it can still be okay. But the best thing is to find sources that are unbiased. So in other words, if you're researching a paper about, is coffee bad for my health, do you want to use a source from Starbucks? No, probably not. That's an obvious one, right? No, but there are others that are more subtle than that. And a lot of times if you're on a website or something and you're looking at a source, you might be able to figure out like who sponsors them. And this, again, this can be really tricky. But if your instructor asks, I really want unbiased sources, you have to be able to try to do this. One of the easiest things to do is to go to the library databases at Morton. So as a student at Morton, you can go to the library, you log in to the library homepage and find the databases. These are all what are called peer-reviewed sources. That means like if they're in the sciences or humanities, multiple professors have read or experts in the field have read the paper and kind of graded it, or judged it as being useful. So that's the best thing. If you can find what are called peer-reviewed sources, you're more likely to get unbiased information. Nothing's ever 100% unbiased, but you can get closer that way. How do you find sources? Well, I was just mentioning, you can go to, I think the best way is our library databases up here at the top. That's why I listed it first, because I think it's the easiest thing. It's free. If you weren't a student at a college, you wouldn't have access to these, because most of these databases, the subscriptions are super expensive. That's how they survive, because they charge institutions like universities and colleges and high school sometimes even to use these databases. So you have access to those. Lots of people, if you're outside that firewall of Morton College, you wouldn't. So it's the best way to find sources is just go into the databases, and you can search by subject, ask a librarian. That's why they're there, and there are great reference librarians that can help you with all this stuff if you're doing a research paper for a class. You can also try to find online dictionaries, encyclopedias, atlases, and things. These reference books, a lot of times they're also in a library, in a physical library, even if you have like a public library near your house you can go to. So that's another good place. Locating articles. Again, most of these articles where it says journals, magazines, newspapers, a lot of these are going to be also available digitally through the library. So more and more, when I first started out, a lot of the sources were paper, but these sources more and more are online. So you don't even have to go into, look through the stacks and find books and so on. You can find most of it online, and journal articles are included there. Again, you can locate books, and if there are books that Morton doesn't have, because we don't have a huge collection of actual paper books, we have a good set of databases, but they can actually borrow them from other larger libraries around the state and even the country sometimes if you need a book. So all this is out there. However far you want to go into this is going to depend on what other classes you're taking. But again, I'm just sharing some information. And a reminder again, you're not required to do research for this class, but again, it's something that we in the English department sort of think of it as our responsibility to talk about, even if we're not doing it in our own classes. All right. If you're doing a research paper that involves more than 5 or 6 sources, you probably want to find some way to keep track of those sources. So one of the easiest things is just to, if you're using a computer, a laptop or something, is just bookmark all the URLs for the pages you're using. Another thing you could do is if you have a library account with our library, and you can have that if you haven't set that up, you can set up so that you can save things, I believe, in your library account with Morton College Library. Another thing you can do, of course, is use just like Google Drive, or pardon me, something like Dropbox, where you can just put all your stuff together. But anyway, I think it can get really unwieldy, and you can get confused if you don't have a good way of keeping track of all of your sources. So however you do that, in the old days, again, it might be like a spiral notebook. Excuse me. And some people today still find that's the best way to keep. A lot of people just like paper. So if that works for you, great. And again, it's not something that's usually required by your professors in any other classes, but it can be something that really helps, just for your own peace of mind, because you're like, oh, where's that one article? And if you've got it all in one file, like a computer file in Google Drive or Google Docs or a folder, that can make all the difference in making sure you get the paper finished in a timely way. So just make that a little larger so we can see it better. That's better. That makes it a little easier to see the screen. All right. So again, yeah, keeping track of your sources, I get that. And then this is something unlikely that, I mean, I wouldn't say unlikely, but you may not do it in very many classes. If you do, I would think, I remember I went on a field trip with criminal justice students, which was very interesting. We went down to, I think it's 26 in California, the courthouse, and actually set in on a murder trial, which was, it was strange, but also, I think interesting for the students. But that's, you're actually going out into the field, maybe early childhood education. You might visit a daycare. If you're, when I was becoming a teacher way back, I used to, part of my original teacher certification when I was teaching high school was to, I had to do student teaching. So that's kind of, in a way, that's kind of field research. I also had to do observations. So medical field a lot, does this. So again, you might have to do this. You might have to interview people, do surveys, and then maybe not. But again, this is a form of research. It's primary. You're kind of getting your own primary sources, and it's considered field research. Just something that Harbrace book says a little bit about. So if you want to look at those page numbers again, all this stuff I'm taking from the Harbrace Essentials book. All right, so that's a little bit about sources. And the other thing that I want to talk about today, it's related to sources. So you've got your sources, you're doing your research, but how do you acknowledge those? I mean, just to basically put them at the end of the paper that you use sources is not enough. Of course, you want to be able to quote or summarize or paraphrase in a way that you don't commit what's called plagiarism, right? And that just has a bad sound. I don't know why. The word plagiarism just sounds bad to me. Maybe because I know it's a bad thing. But plagiarism is, and I don't mean to make a joke out of it, but plagiarism, the reason it's so important to me to talk about it is because you could do this in another class, and it could be serious enough that if a professor felt like you were committing plagiarism, which is basically just using somebody else's ideas like they're your own, which is, we could call it cheating, basically, right? If it's serious enough, you could be, basically expelled from the college. I mean, it's very, it can be very serious. So I want to help you prevent that. And there's 3 easy ways to do that. And, the main thing about this, that I will say, this is the most important point. As long as your intentions are good, if you make grammar errors, probably nobody's going to really try to come down on you really hard, like, oh my gosh, this person cited their sources wrong. It's just when you try to pass something off as your own ideas. Now, be aware, these days, the technology, like if you turn in a paper and it's got stuff that's just been cut and pasted from the internet, it shows me right away. That's just part of Blackboard when you hand it. That's why I use Turnitin. That's why all the teachers often use Turnitin, because Turnitin just combs the internet and it says, oh, okay, all these were borrowed. So if those are borrowed, as long as you try to cite it in some way, you put a page number or you quoted and you said, this is from this article, totally fine. I'll correct the grammar if it's wrong, but it's not like you really did anything wrong. You just made a grammar error. Plagiarism is where you're basically, in my mind anyway, intentionally trying to cheat, basically to cut something out of somebody else's article and then put it into your own and pass it off as your own work. So again, that's where it gets serious. If you make a grammar mistake, don't worry about that. As long as your intentions are good, you're trying to say, hey, I got this from a website, that's perfect. Well, not perfect, but it's good enough that you won't get in trouble. It's better if it's grammatically correct too. And we'll talk about how to do that. So here's the 3 things you can do. You've got a source of information. You're using it in your paper. Again, just one more time, I'll repeat it. You are not required to do research for my class this semester. This is just something that we talk about, but you might. So if you're using sources, though, you do want to cite them. So if you, even though we're not doing a research paper, if you decided, oh, I went out and I found this, even if it's from our short story that we're reading, you still want to cite it. So how can you do that? One way is to do a direct quotation. I think everybody probably knows what that is, but I'm just going to say a little bit about it just to make sure. Or you can do a paraphrase, and again, you may be familiar with that, and summary. These are probably terms you've heard and you're familiar with, but I want to go over each one just briefly so everybody's clear, because these are the 3 ways of making sure that you don't commit plagiarism, that you're being honest about borrowing your ideas. And there's nothing wrong with borrowing. One of my favorite current books these days is the book called Steal Like an Artist. And that's what we do that in academics too. We steal stuff, but we put quotation marks and we explain where we got it from. And that's totally fine. All right, so using direct quotations, here's something from one of my favorite poets, a guy named T.S. Eliot, who grew up down in St. Louis, not too far from here. So he grew up in the Midwest. Maybe their winters are not quite as bad as ours, but you know that feeling in April when it's like, okay, winter's been going on about long enough. It's April, and you get a nice sunny day, and then the next day it snows or something. It's really cold, right? It rains or whatever, freezing. And I think that's why T.S. Eliot once said, April is the cruelest month. It's just like teasing you. You're like, it's going to be warm. No, sorry, we're back to winter. So I can't really think of a better way to say that. I can't come up with something in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words that's going to convey that much meaning as T.S. Eliot did. So that to me is a good thing to choose as a quotation, a direct quotation, which means I want to highlight a specific passage. I want to retain the beauty or clarity of someone's words. He's a poet, so he had a way of writing that I can't probably imitate, and I want to reveal the reasoning maybe of it. Maybe somebody just, I also think this reasoning is really good because it is that feeling of, I understand what that means, or just discuss it like we've been doing now, what it might mean. So if for some reason you just really want to use their exact words, that's the time to use a direct quotation. So you don't necessarily want to use a direct quotation for everything, but for these kinds of situations where you just think they just said it better than anybody else is going to say it, so I'm just going to use their exact words. That's a good reason for a direct quotation. But another thing you can do is what's called paraphrase. So we think about that quote again. T.S. Eliot, I used his exact words, I quoted him. Maybe for some reason it didn't really fit in with my paper, and so I'm just going to put it in my own words, right? Now this is kind of tricky also because just changing like a or an or the doesn't really necessarily paraphrase. That's kind of getting in a little bit of a problem. So as long as you actually put it in your own words, don't just change 1 or 2, but you rewrite it, his ideas, right? According to T.S. Eliot, April can be a difficult time of the year, and you can see how that sounds nothing like his to me beautiful poetic line here. April is the cruelest month. Now it doesn't sound as good. It's paraphrased. It's in my own words, and it's very clearly not T.S. Eliot. One of the reasons you might want to do this is you want to clarify difficult material by making it simpler. I think this is clearer in a way. It's not poetic, it's not beautiful, but it's clear, right? April can be kind of difficult, especially when we're ready for winter to be over. You want to use another person's ideas, but for whatever reason, you don't want to use their exact words. And a lot of reasons that's because you want a consistent tone in your writing. And if you start quoting too much, it's sort of like this back and forth feeling, and it doesn't sound like it's your paper. It's just like a collection of quotes. So this is another reason to do it. But anyway, paraphrase is you put it in your own words. It's about the same length. You're not making it shorter or trying to shrink it down or anything, but it's just in your own words. And finally, the last way to use somebody's ideas so you're not committing plagiarism is to summarize. And use summaries. Here we go. In T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, the author, this is summarizing the whole poem. This is not summarizing the quote, right? Because the quote's only a line. But this is like this whole poem, The Wasteland, which is a long poem. It's several pages. And I cut it down to about 3 sentences, right? To get kind of the main idea. And in T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, the author combines ideas from the Holy Grail legend, Shakespeare, Dante, and many other sources to explore themes of disillusionment and despair. Sounds cheerful, doesn't it? It's not. It's a very dark poem. But so I just gave you this kind of sense of this poem in just a few lines, and the poem is much longer than that. So what you do with the summary, present the ideas of others in a brief fashion, provide an overview of a complex idea or text, which is it's a very complicated poem, and I tried to just say it simply, and then you show your understanding of a text or idea. So these are some of the things you can do with a summary. So sometimes when you're writing a paper, you just want to show the professor that you got the concept, and a summary is a good way to do that. Now these are 3 ways you can quote. That means you're going to have quotation marks. So I want to say something about that. Even with a summary, you don't use quotation marks, but you do still usually say where you got it. And same thing with a paraphrase. You still have to say, somehow letting your reader know that you're summarizing somebody else's work, because otherwise, again, that's still plagiarism. But let's look at some of how that looks more detail here. Here is something that we would do with quotation marks, and there's a couple ways you can call these, but the book calls them attributive tags. So you're putting a little tag on something, basically naming. Sometimes we call them signal phrases, but letting them know that you're quoting, right? In cybersecurity today, Chris Allen. So usually you either have sometimes you have the article you're quoting from or book, and you have the author's name. If you mention it multiple times, you don't have to say that over and over. You could just, but you might start out and say, in cybersecurity today, Chris Allen states that, and then you give your quote. So this is a really important part of when you're doing a quote, you have to introduce it somehow. And that's what we call attributive tags. It's just, imagine like you put a tag on something. This is naming it. This is what it is. And this is a quote from Chris Allen in his article from Cybersecurity Today. According to Allen, this might be the second time you refer. Like if you're quoting the same article and you bring in quotes 3 or 4 times, in Allen's view, if you want to see a list of this, because it gets kind of boring if you say over and over, Chris Allen states, Mark Miller states, Betty Ford states, or whatever, So on page 94 of our Harbor Race book, section 11C, there's a list of these, and you can always just Google it too, what are called signal phrases or attributive tags. And that can help, again, if you're having to quote quite a few people, how to do that. Of course, you have to use quotation marks. This is on pages 387 to 392, kind of toward the back of the Harbor Race book. When you're using direct quotations, you use your attributive tags. It can be at the beginning, can be at the middle, doesn't matter, but it's going to be set off with a comma and quotation marks. Martha Graham famously said, she was a famous dancer, and she said, dance is the hidden language of the soul. You can turn it all around if you want to and just say the quote first, then put a comma inside the quotation mark and give your attributive tag or your signal phrase. Dance is the hidden language of the soul, Martha Graham once said. So this is really important with quotation marks. And again, if you don't know, you can always just Google quotation mark rules, or you can look at this section in the Harbor Race, which gives lots of examples of how to do that. And one more thing, when a sentence ends with quoted material, you just place the period inside the quotation marks. So this is basically, I believe we learned by practice, and they put their attributive tag right in the middle, writes Martha Graham. Then they started a new quote, whether it means to learn to dance by practicing dancing or to learn to live by practicing living. Principles are the same. We put our period here inside the quotation mark, if you can see that. All right, well, that is a lot, I know, but again, these 3 things, if you're trying to avoid plagiarism and trying to make sure that you're showing that you know that you're borrowing somebody's ideas and you're doing it above board, direct quotations, paraphrase, and summary are really the best ways to do that. So I will leave it here because it's already been a long video, and I will see you in the reading video, hopefully. If you have any questions about any of this, check the Harbor Race Essentials book. Also, remember online writing lab at Purdue University called the OWL. They have lots of stuff there that can help. Or come to office hours or send me an email. And I will, again, hope to see you either in office hours or in the next video. I won't really see you, but we'll connect in that way.